today, and thank you all for coming. We're going to dive right in because we actually have a lot to cover, and there's a lot of interesting information after this also. So what are the basics? The FTZ program actually goes back to 1934, as Joe said. It was during the New Deal. Of course, there was a lot going on with tariffs and whatnot at that point, and this was a means that Congress saw to really encourage activity, employment, and eventually manufacturing here in the United States. So the program actually has quite a history. Essentially what it is, a foreign trade zone is a place that's designated by the Foreign Trade Zones Board, activated by U.S. Customs and Border Protection. We'll get into what that means in a little bit. But it's really a specific location here in the U.S. where different customs procedures can be used. And those customs procedures mean that you can really delay the customs entry on merchandise. That's the quick summary. We're going to get into what that means, possibly for you as a company in terms of duties and the potential savings that it could involve. But essentially, that's all it is. It's a place here in the U.S. where special customs procedures can be used. The idea behind the program initially, in 1934 and still now, was to encourage activity and investment, employment here in the U.S. that could otherwise be done abroad for customs reasons. And it's really, I mean, that was the original purpose. That's still what we're trying to do today. So we kind of summarized, and we are going to get into the details of each of these, but FTZ procedures allow activity here in the United States. And first of all, I don't want anyone to get the wrong impression. Foreign trade zones are very much a part of the United States. Merchandise that goes into a foreign trade zone has not been entered for consumption, but it has been imported into the U.S. So these are locations here in the U.S., but once again, simply where special customs procedures can be used. You can defer that customs entry. U.S. FTZs are very much, though, within the territory of the U.S. and subject to all other federal, state, and local laws. So some of you might have heard about, say, for example, free trade zone programs in other countries, where there may be different labor laws or different tax laws that apply. And so I'm sorry to tell you that is not the case here in the U.S. It really is simply about the customs procedures, the timing of the customs entry, but all other federal, state, and local laws do apply. So I hope nobody gets up and walks out right now, but it is an important point, and it's a common misunderstanding that people think a foreign trade zone is, say, outside of the U.S. somehow, or outside of an agency's jurisdiction. So we will talk about the benefits, don't worry, but I want to get that out there up front, that this really is about the timing of the customs entry. So before a company can actually use the FTZ, I mentioned before that FTZs are locations designated by the FTZ board. So that's step one. Before the FTZ can be used, it has to go through a process of activation with U.S. Customs and Border Protection. So step one, get it designated. Step two, activate with U.S. Customs. CBP is actually the agency that involved in the day-to-day oversight of the FTZ activity. My office has the very lucky position of dealing with the theoretical. You can have an FTZ here, you can do this type of activity, but we're not the ones on the ground handling the day-to-day oversight. That's U.S. Customs and Border Protection. So step two with the FTZ is applying to CBP to activate and be able to use the FTZ. And all FTZ activity then remains under U.S. CBP supervision. So anything that goes into an FTZ is done with through CBP procedures. Anything that goes out of an FTZ is through CBP procedures. And I'm sure the good folks here in the center of the room can tell you more about those details. But FTZs are also open to spot checks. It's something to be aware of, again, if you're considering the program, that the facility remains under a customs bond. And so you are, the way you track inventory, what you bring in, where everything is, how you're accounting for it, is very important in the FTZ environment. So the way the FTZ program is structured, and again, this goes back to 1934 when Congress set up the program. They created the FTZ board, and the board, I'm actually on the board staff. The FTZ board itself is the Department of Commerce and the Department of Treasury. I'm with the staff of the board, we're located in Commerce, but the way it works after that is the board designates public or public type organizations to act as something we call FTZ grantees. And the grantee is the local organization that manages the zone. And all authority from the FTZ board goes through the grantee. In this area, it's the city of San Jose. So Joe is your face for the FTZ grantee here in San Jose, in the San Jose area, I should say. The grantee is then responsible actually for acting as a public utility and providing zone services on a uniform basis to companies in a region. So that the grantee is also the one that markets the zone. The grantee, of course, is not the one handling merchandise or concerned about that type of thing. The grantee is the one that makes sure that companies can access the program in their area. In order to use an FTZ, you as a company will need to work with your local grantee, either the city of San Jose here in this area, or most actually customs ports of entries, there is a grantee and an FTZ established. So if you're in a different area, there's probably already a grantee there that you can work with. You might be able to work with one even a little bit further if there's not. But in most parts of the country now, there is a grantee established, a zone you can use, and you would need to work with and through that grantee to get access to the FTZ program. What can you do in a zone? The FTZ Act itself has a whole list of these specific activities you can do. The important things: warehousing, distribution, of course, that type of activity, manufacturing, production, you'll hear us call it. What you can't do is the important thing: no retail trade. So these are not duty-free shops. You also can't live in an FTZ, if you would want to. But basically anything else in the course of normal business activity can be done in an FTZ. If you're doing anything that falls under our definition of production, which is essentially, does it change the HTS classification at the 6-digit level, then you need specific authority from the FTZ board. If you're not doing that, if you're simply, say, warehousing, you're running a distribution facility, you need designation of your site from the FTZ board, and you can then apply to CBP to activate. But if you're doing any production activity, and again, for our purposes, that's anything that changes the classification at the 6-digit level, then you need specific authority from the FTZ board. And we'll talk about how to get that. If you've heard about the program in the past and lengthy application processes, book length, year-long process, the good news is it's nothing like that anymore. But first of all, why would you want to do this to begin with? What are the benefits? So we talked really at the high level. FTZs are places where you can defer U.S. customs entry. What does that mean for you as a company? It means if you're operating a distribution facility, you bring merchandise into your FTZ, and again, when you bring it into your FTZ, you've not filed a customs entry, you have not paid duty, you're doing something called an admission. It's coming into the U.S., but you're not filing an entry. You can store it in your FTZ, and you don't file the entry and pay the duties until it leaves your FTZ for the US market. So especially if you have high values, and right now it's not uncommon to have high duty rates on some components, you can defer the payment of those duties until you file that entry, it leaves your FTZ for the US market. If you re-export the merchandise, you've never filed an entry. So you never pay the duty. And of course, if you're operating a distribution facility, I'm just using that as an example right now, say you have customers in Canada, other places, this can be your distribution facility for the North American market. Bring merchandise here, defer the duty on what you're ultimately bringing into the US market, and you never file an entry or pay duty on shipments elsewhere. So that could, especially now with components having some higher duty rates, that could be a real benefit for some companies. Traditionally, the biggest benefit for companies has been what we refer to as the inverted tariff. Now, if any of you have actually seen a printed copy of the HTS, the Harmonized Tariff Schedule, the document that sets the duty rates for anything that comes into the country, if you print it out, it's probably about this thick. It was a few years ago, the last time I saw a printed copy, and it was 3 volumes about this big each. I don't know what it would be right now, but it's a long document. There's a lot in there. And it's not uncommon for there to be situations, unintentionally, of course, where there's a higher duty rate on a component that you need in your manufacturing operations compared to what you're producing, your finished products. And if that's the case for you as a company, what you can do, and again, this does require approval from the FTZ board, but what you can do is bring in those components into your facility, combine them with domestic merchandise. And when you ship them to the US market, when you file that entry, you can pay duty on the value of those foreign components at the lower finished product duty rate. So it's a bit of a complex situation, but if you can imagine, say you're making cars have a 2.5% duty rate. Does that apply to electric vehicles also? It does, okay. So your cars have a 2.5% duty rate. I know that is the case. I'm gonna make something up now, but say you're, I know this is not going to be true now. We're gonna say radios because it's easy to imagine, but say you're bringing in radios that have a 5% duty rate. You bring it into the FTZ, you manufacture it into your car. When it leaves the FTZ for the US market, you can pay the 2.5% duty rate on the value of those radios because it's been manufactured into a car. So you can see right there, again, depending on your industry, depending on what components you're using, there could be real savings. And the reality behind this is most companies that are importing components, they're importing some components, they're using others that are sourced domestically. We live in a global economy. You know, there is a lot of sourcing that does occur from abroad, and it's very difficult for a company to source everything domestically. We recognize that. The point is, we would rather have you conduct that activity here than, say, go to another country, make your finished car, and pay 2.5% on the whole thing. We want you to do it here. Employ US workers, US value added, do the activity here so we can give you the same customs tariff situation as if you were conducting it abroad, but you're employing US workers. So for most companies, if you're manufacturing, this is where the big savings are. But again, it does vary by company. So you will need to take a look at the specific things that you're bringing in and the duty rates on those and the duty rates on what you're producing. Now, very importantly, what I want to point out here before, once again, anyone gets too excited, the little asterisk we should put at the end of this, that this really applies to those unintentional duty situations. So in that long and complicated HTS schedule, where those situations just happen to arise, that there is a higher duty rate on your finished or on your component compared to your finished product. Where this cannot be used is where there are intentional duties placed on things. The obvious examples there, of course, are anti-dumping, countervailing duties, Section 201, Section 301, 232, excuse me, also, the big ones. Those actually, anything subject to any of those measures has to be placed in a special status when it goes into the FTZ. And that status locks in its identity. So even if those items are manufactured into something that is not subject to those duties, you still have to pay those duties when they leave the zone for the US market. Now, that's again for the US market. If you're exporting those, then once again, you would never have filed an entry. So if you are subject to any of those types of special duties and you have any exports, the FTZ could still be an option. And actually, we've heard from companies recently that have started using the program simply to defer those duties because they can be quite high. But the FTZ cannot be a loophole around them. So we're here to help US manufacturers, but we can't be a loophole around very intentional government policy either. All right, a few other things to mention. So there are logistical benefits that companies can achieve through the FTZ as well. In addition to what we've heard from some companies is that their insurance costs might actually decrease because they've gone through the activation process. Their processes are secure, their inventory is very controlled. So, but beyond that, there are actually some other procedures that you may qualify for, such as direct delivery, which could, with CBP again, and they can actually answer more detailed questions about these than I can. But basically, your product may be able to move more smoothly and quickly to your facility from the port. And you may also qualify for something called weekly entry, which means that instead of filing one entry every time something leaves your FTZ, and of course paying the associated merchandise processing fees and any broker fees, you can set up a process with CBP so that you only file one entry per week. So one merchandise processing fee, one broker fee for the week. So for some companies, again, if you meet the criteria and it's approved by CBP, there can be some significant savings there as well. Luckily, the last bullet here does not apply to California. So there are a few states left that have an inventory tax, and merchandise in an FTZ is impacted by the inventory tax. And it's actually much simpler for you to access the program without that, because there are some specific things that have to occur to make sure that, say, local school districts are not then negatively impacted by the FTZ. So the happy news we can share for you here is you don't really have to worry about that last bullet here in California. And it says it's a benefit, but it actually does make it a little bit more difficult to access the program. Another important thing, and this I think is a little bit of a lesser known benefit to the program, we call it the production equipment benefit. So if you have an FTZ and you're set up for manufacturing, you have what we call production authority from the FTZ board, or you're in the process of applying for it, and you're constructing a plant or you're expanding a plant, you don't need any separate approval. You can bring in any imported production equipment into the FTZ in FTZ status, assemble it, test it. You don't have to file an entry and pay duty on that production equipment until it's ready to go into use. So again, if you have a large plant with a lot of equipment that, say, you can only buy from overseas, this can help you to defer the duty on that equipment or possibly even reduce it. Again, because of that inverted tariff we were talking about, there might be a lower duty rate on that equipment than as assembled than in the pieces that it was brought in. So if you're, again, this doesn't apply just to new plants, but if you have an existing plant and you're expanding it, this could be either way. But obviously, if it's new construction, a new plant, this could be a real benefit. We've already touched on this, but why does the program exist generally? The idea, of course, we said, was to encourage activity and employment here in the U.S., facilitate international commerce, I think is also stated in the FTZ Act. Keep things moving, help encourage and attract activity here, that we're open for business and business can operate smoothly here. So come conduct your activity here in the US instead of doing it abroad. That's what it comes down to. I talked a little bit about the structure, and I don't want to steal Joe's thunder later. He said he was going to talk about his role as grantee also, but I'll just give you a quick background because it is a little bit hard to visualize and it sounds very bureaucratic. We've got this board and then we've got customs and we have all these organizations involved, but this is just a quick summary of how it's structured. So the FTZ board, and again that's Secretary of Commerce and the Secretary of Treasury, is at the top there. So my office would be a little box off of that, where there's staff. But the FTZ board grants the authority to organizations, that's why we call them the grantees, in this case the City of San Jose. And the City of San Jose manages the zone locally and provides access to companies in that region. So the grantee is next, below the FTZ board. The operator is the company that's holding the bond with CBP. So an operator may be processing its own merchandise, we'll get to that on the next slide. But basically, the operator is the one that's responsible to CBP. They've gone through the activation process, they're holding the bond, and they're doing that under the authority of the grantee. So to be an FTZ operator, you'll actually enter into an agreement with the grantee to essentially use their authority. Now, at the very bottom here, we call the user. So the user is essentially the one that's benefiting from the FTZ, probably the owner of the merchandise. The user could be the operator. So you could be an operator processing your own merchandise, in which case, you'd be that one over on the far right-hand side, whichever screen we're looking at, the operator user. You're processing your own merchandise, you have the bond with CBP, but you could also be acting as operator, say a logistics company, and have multiple users. Again, that's perfectly fine. It's actually not uncommon. And in that case, it'd be this box over here on the left-hand side where you have multiple users underneath the operator. So there can be different ways of structuring the FTZ. Even in one zone, there can be different setups for different companies. You might hear some of these words getting tossed around though, so I wanted to make sure you knew what they were. So the process has changed pretty dramatically in the past about 10 years in terms of accessing the program. When I started out in this office, it was not uncommon. A company wanted to use the zone. They come in with what we call a Subzone application to have their facility designated. It's about this thick, and they'd submit it to us, and we'd say, great, we'll get back to you in about a year. It didn't work very well. It was actually, we didn't do many of these types of events because, well, you can imagine what the response would have been. Very simply, it just did not work. And there were different ways we tried to get around and tried to do things on a quicker basis. And quite frankly, it was a mess. We needed to make changes, and we did. About 10 years ago, we came up with something we called the Alternative Site Framework. And of course, the only reason it has that name is there's the way things had always been done. So we call that the traditional site framework. And we gave grantees this option of using this new format, this new structure really for their zones. What it means, essentially, is that the grantee has done a lot of the work up front. So what used to take all those steps we would have to take, because the FTZ Act tells us we have to take them, the grantee has done it up front. And that means that when a company wants to use the FTZ program, the grantee has done all the work. There's very little left that needs to be done. We can designate a site or a subzone, essentially the same terminology, designate something for your company when and where you need it in a very quick and simple process. Again, for really reasons of evolution and how things have developed throughout the program, you'll see the phrase usage-driven site and subzone kind of used interchangeably. Again, unfortunately, we have two terms from them, how things have evolved. If we were designing the program from new, we would only have one term. But if you're a company that wants to use the FTZ program, you would either have a usage-driven site or a subzone designated for you. The process is the same. What you can do in it is the same. There's really no substantive difference. It's just the way things have evolved. You can call it whatever you want. And anywhere within the area that the grantee has designated, the FTZ board has approved as what we call a service area for that zone, you can get your site designation from the FTZ board within 30 days. And I can say this on behalf of my colleague Chris Kemp that would handle your application. We both have a similar policy. If it's on our desk, it's complete, it's not going to take you 30 days to get a decision. He's out of town right now, so if you submit it, well, he's back in the office in about a week and a half, I think. So you might have to wait a week and a half. But we both have a pretty strict clean desk policy. So if it comes in, we're going to get it back out to you as soon as possible. It says 30 days. It's probably not even going to take 30 days. So it's a very simple, I think we have a slide. Whoops. Okay, we'll go back to that. But this shows you really what we're asking for. What's your company name? What's the address, the acreage? Do you have the right to use the site? We need a map. You will need to talk to U.S. Customs and Border Protection because we need to know that they will be able to oversee the site. And that's it. Send that into us, and we will get it right back out to you with your site or your subzone designation. And it's really that simple. Going back up to that slide I skipped, and again, I won't hover on this too long because I think Joe is going to cover something similar, but you might not be able to read most of it. But at the top of the screen, it's the service area for the San Jose zone. So anywhere within that area, you can use this quick and simple process to have it designated. If you're not within that, don't worry. We'll talk about that in a minute. The rest of that what you see up here is what appears on our page, our website that provides information about each zone. So Joe's contact information is up there. But just to give you a summary, this information is up there on our website for all zones. So if you have facilities located elsewhere, this information is available. The same information is available in those zones as well. Now, you're looking at that list and saying, gosh, it sounds great, but I'm just outside that area that's called the service area. What do I do? First of all, don't panic. It's not quite as simple, it's not quite as short, but we've still drastically shortened the process even without being in this ASF service area to bring designation to a company. So if you're outside the ASF service area, it has to be called a subzone, and it's either a 3 or 5 month process. Otherwise, the information we ask for is the same, except that we also need the legal authority for the zone to submit the application. So that's one of the things that's already been done, that the grantee's already done for their service area. So if it's a subzone outside the service area, it's one of the things we need to cover. Unfortunately, the way our regs are structured, there's also a fee for those types of applications, and there's not a fee under the service area, but there is if it's not under the service area. Those are really the only differences. Otherwise, it's just a few months longer. We will have to open a public comment period for these types of applications. We usually don't get comments on this type of thing, but it is a step that we will have to go through. So we have the site designated or the subzone designated, but you're also going to be manufacturing. What do you do then? So it is a separate request, but you don't need to wait. So you could actually start your request for production authority, we call it, from the FTZ board. You can start that at any time. You don't have to have your subzone designated yet. You can start this request whenever you're ready. The request for production authority is a 120-day process with the FTZ board. So again, production in the FTZ world, what you need authority for is anything that changes the HTS classification at the 6-digit level. That, of course, was going to include any traditional manufacturing, but what it also includes is things you would not think of initially. So you're, say, a distribution facility and you have some clients that have asked you to do a little bit of a different activity in your warehouse for them this year. They're bringing in bottles of liquor and some glassware, and they say, hey, can you just bring these into your FTZ, put them in a box together, so I'm ready for the holiday season, I can get them out to the stores. Sounds simple, it's going to employ at least a few people. Sounds good. That is actually production activity in the FTZ world, because you're bringing in the liquor bottles, and you're importing, in this example, you're importing the liquor bottles and you're importing the glassware and putting them together in a box. And when they leave the zone, they're going to be classified as the liquor. So you could actually be reducing the duty on that glassware. So it's not, people think of production activity, that's, a big factory. It's not necessarily. If you're reducing the duty rate, you're changing the HTS classification on those items, then it's something that you do need production authority from the FTZ board. So just be aware, it's not, there could be situations that you wouldn't initially think of where you do need authority from the FTZ board. If you do, it's okay. It's not a really lengthy process. It's 120 days from the time you submit the application to us until the time a decision is made. And there's not much to this request either. So, the steps we have to take into account. We will open up a public comment period, and we will just discuss briefly with industry specialists within commerce. But that's it. And the information that you have to submit to us, it's really, again, your company, where you're located, and then we'll ask for a list of your finished products. So that's what leaves your zone, and your imported components, what goes into your zone. And that's all we're asking for. We'll go through these steps, and if we don't see any issues, then we'll say go ahead and do it at day 120. Now, if we do see issues, okay, so that's that 120-day process. If we do see issues, then we might have to bump it to a longer process, but in the history, so these regs have been in place since 2012. I think we've had 300 some requests for production activity and about 10 that we've said we need to review this through the more detailed process. And it's usually pretty predictable industries. Manufacturing textiles has always been very controversial in FTZ environments. So, I mean, for the most part, companies get the authorization within 120 days. And if you give us a list of, say, 20 components that you're importing, and we have concerns about one of them, we're not going to say no to the whole thing. We can say, yes, go ahead and do it, but for this one, you have to put it in a special status. So you can't reduce the duty on that item. So, you know, don't be afraid even that the whole thing's going to get denied. You know, if there is that concern about one little product, we can just authorize everything else. So the timeline overall is pretty simple. And again, these processes do not have to run back to back. They can run at the same time. You can get your production notification in before your Subzone application. You can have them running at the same time. You can do the Subzone first and then your production. So it is two processes, but they're both pretty simple. And you know, you can start either one of them whenever you're ready. So within the service area, 30 days to get your Subzone, say, designated, and 120 days for your production notification. The reality is, most companies can't be activated with CBP in that time frame anyway, that it's going to take longer for you to get all the requirements that CBP has. So while your applications are being processed by the FTZ board, you can also be discussing the activation with CBP, getting ready so that when you have the authorization, you're as ready to go as possible and can get up and running as soon as possible. So you're designated, you have all your approvals in place, CBP has approved your activation. Oh, no, sorry, didn't look too carefully at the slide. So you get your designations in place, then you apply to CBP to actually activate. I hinted at that it was a more involved process with CBP, and again, they can answer details on that. But basically, it will involve background investigations on key employees. CBP is going to take a look at the inventory control system that you're using, make sure that everything can be tracked from when the time it comes to the zone, through any processes you're doing in the zone, until the time when it leaves the zone. Of course, they're also going to look at the security in place at your facility, and you'll need to post a bond and have a written procedures manual. Okay. Good thing hopefully there's no questions on that, otherwise I will defer them to CBP. But otherwise, once you're approved, you're up and running, you're using the FTZ, there are a few things you will need to do. Joe mentioned, there is an annual report to the FTZ board. We take all that information from you. You actually submit it to Joe. Joe will submit it to us. And we're required, again, this comes down to the law, we're required to submit a report to Congress. So we're required to do it, but I think it's actually very helpful. Without that requirement, it could be difficult to get everyone to submit it in, but it's really useful to have information about what's happening in the program. So the information you submit there is actually really, really important in terms of how the program is being used, and helpful for you as a company also. You can take a look at the last year's report and see what types of companies are using it. Is this something that might benefit me if all my competitors are using it? It's helpful in that sense as well. On an annual basis, you'll also have to do what's called a reconciliation of your inventory and report the results of that to CBP. But again, they can give more information on those details. So a little bit of background, there are zones in all 50 states and Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico is part of the customs territory of the US. More than 500 subzones, far more sites than that. We had 3,200 companies using the zone in our last report, and about 450,000 employees. So there's a lot of companies in this country and a lot of employees. These are just the employees in the activated areas of the zone. So if you're designated, but you're not using the zone, we're not counting those employees. These are the ones from the again, the activated companies. This is the employees in that area. So the numbers are pretty big. I should actually run the statistics, but I think that $670 billion in merchandise handled through the zones. In terms of the foreign status merchandise coming into zones, I think it's about 10 to 12% of imports into the country are coming through FTZs. So the numbers are pretty big. And we had about 87 billion exported last year. These are just a few of the largest users in the program. One of the changes we've seen as we've simplified the process to get sites designated and to get production authority in, quicker and simpler basis for companies, we've seen a lot of smaller companies enter the program that really could not in the past. So they're not necessarily going to be reflected in this list, but we have seen a huge growth in the number of small companies throughout the country that are using the program. So again, if you don't see what appears to be your industry on this list, don't worry. It doesn't mean that there's not a benefit there, or not savings there, or it's not something that you can do. But this is just as background. These are some of the biggest users of the program. I am not Chris. But I did want to give you your regional contact. So my colleague Chris is the one that would be processing your request, your site, your usage-driven request, and he really knows the details of each zone in this region far better than I do. But like I said, I'm not going to hang up on you if you call. So contact anyone on our staff. We're actually a staff of 10 people total. So, we're a pretty tight-knit staff, and, if you have questions about anything, you can contact any of us. I don't know how much time we have for questions, but happy to answer any questions.
The questions
at the end. Okay, sorry about that.